Is the shadowing technique really effective in language learning? You might have already heard of something called the shadowing technique, but is it really effective? So we'll be diving into what the shadowing technique is, how it works, and whether it might be right for you. My name's Chris, I'm a French teacher at OuiCommunicate, and I propose we get started. So what is shadowing? Well, according to AI, the definition of shadowing is that it's a language learning technique where you listen to an audio recording of a native speaker and simultaneously repeat the words out loud, trying to perfectly mimic their pronunciation, rhythm and intonation. So the goal is to focus on the sounds of the language without relying on reading or consciously thinking about grammar. And it's like training your mouth and ear to work together. What do we think of that? Is shadowing a good technique? Wow. I think in language learning, so this is my take on it, in language learning, asking whether a technique is simply good or bad can be misleading, because almost anything you do can be beneficial from a certain perspective. So yeah, shadowing is generally a method that teachers would approve of. And I can well imagine in school, I can picture it in front of me, a pupil telling their Spanish teacher, telling their French teacher, oh, you know, when I get home, I listen to audio recordings and I repeat them. Teacher, very impressed. That's brilliant, Timmy. I'm not putting it down, but I can well picture it in front of me that it's something that teachers will generally be enthusiastic about, because it seems to make a lot of sense. But just because something isn't a waste of time doesn't also mean it's effective for everyone. Very important distinction. And in languages, experience has shown me that a technique can be not bad and not great at the same time. So when is shadowing learning effective? Well, I'll tell you what I think. I don't think that shadowing is effective at every stage of learning. I think it requires determination and a strong mindset, because it involves repeatedly mimicking sentences, which I think casual learners might find a bit tedious. That's the first thing. As an advanced technique for advanced learners, I think that shadowing can work really well, but I also think only if you know what you're trying to achieve. And I think it's a very important distinction. If you know what you're trying to achieve, it can be a brilliant technique. But I also think that most average learners, casual learners, might not know what they're trying to achieve. And I'm not dismissing the casual learner, it's not that, but I don't think most learners clearly understand their goals or what they hope to gain from shadowing. And it probably makes the technique less effective or even frustrating. I also see some very practical challenges to shadow learning. And I like when things work in reality. That's just me as a teacher. Imagine an obsessed learner of American English who repeats phrases from films and audiobooks and who hopes to catch that specific accent. Maybe California, maybe New Jersey. But several questions quickly arise. The first one is, which accent should you imitate? Which accent are we going for? Do you have to stick to just one speaker from one region, or can you mix several American accents or several British accents? And I think the answer might affect your results in a meaningful way. The next question is, which resources do you use? As we know, audiobooks are read very differently from how journalists speak or commentators debate. What style should you mimic? A third question is, are all accents equally accessible? Not all accents have abundant or high quality resources available for shadowing. So for example, some regional or minority accents have very limited recordings or authentic materials, which really restricts what learners can realistically practice. And a fourth very practical challenge is that I think you have to consider age, gender, and evolution of languages. It has been proven that women and men have different patterns of speaking, so they do speak differently. They use varied vocabulary and tones, and for example, certainly in English, some non-native speakers mimic the typical British feminine rising tone, which I really can't do. I'll give it a try in a second. which can sound unnatural or even amusing to native ears. And I actually heard a man speaking with this sort of feminine rising tone that they do in Britain. It's sort of the equivalent of the what's it called, the Californian Valley girl accent. They'll say, for example, I was bored, so I called her, you know, and I've heard people imitate this, you know, this rising tone, which is done for, I think, for reasons that non-natives might not understand. And it sounds a bit odd, at least to my ears. Another challenge I see in this list that's starting to grow quite long is that I don't believe that most learners, that the casual learner of a language exactly knows, and I'm underlining, insisting on the word know, what they're aiming for. Like really a technical knowledge of what they're aiming for. So the ultimate goal of sounding natural is of course to master prosody, which the casual learner might not know. They might not even know it's a thing, right? That's what I'm talking about. I'm not putting down the average learner, the casual learner, but when you try to achieve something, you have to know it exists and you have to understand what it means. So here, now we're talking about prosody, right? That's the ultimate goal, which is something that native speakers use naturally. So we're talking about the patterns of stress, the rhythm of the language, the intonation that gives language its own music. Right? French has a specific music, English has different musics in the plural depending on where you're from. And I think this is where most techniques, including shadowing, fall short. And I'm not saying I have the answer. To me, prosody is the big mystery. I don't know how you teach it. Most schools do not teach it, certainly not for English. It's very, very, very hard to accomplish. It's really very, very hard. So an advanced learner of a language might want to improve prosody, which also implies that they know it exists, that they know that prosody is a thing. This requires really deep knowledge of a language and languages in general. So others might hope, non-specialists might hope that shadowing leads to a type of subconscious mastery of that genuine accent. I think it's possible, but it comes with risks also. And let's be fair, I think that when we talk about shadowing, it's sort of the implicit promise it holds, isn't it? When you do shadowing, the implicit promise is that, well, don't worry about grammar, don't worry about rationalizing, just repeat the sentences and it will come, you'll pick up that genuine accent. What I'm doing in this video is saying, yeah, it all seems great on paper, however, watch out, because it's not so simple. You see, I'm not saying it's completely useless, but I am saying, yeah, but it's not so simple. One of these complexities is the risk of a muddled accent, and especially for English, you might end up with a muddled accent. Now, does it matter? Does it, as long as you're understood, right? I think there's less of a risk in French because it's a different type of language than English, but I think that shadowing could possibly lead to muddled accents, unnatural mixes that native speakers can find disconcerting. For example, a non-native who's really worked hard to imitate a certain British accent from a certain place, or a French accent from Marseille, or l'accent d'Occitan, something like that, might still sound off, because accents always carry a sense of identity and belonging. It's not so easy just to imitate an accent. So I think that without mastering certain subtle aspects of the language, prosody, the falling and the rising tones, these may be used incorrectly and even confuse listeners. And this is what I meant when I said that the average casual learner might not know what they're trying to accomplish. They might not know that prosody exists. They might not know that rising tones and falling tones are a thing that influence the message. Because you have to be interested in languages at that level to know that it's even a thing. And you must have studied languages to have an interest in it and know that it's a thing. So this is why I'm very cautious when we say shadowing, yeah, but do you know what you're trying to accomplish? Do you know that the things you're trying to accomplish or that you are accomplishing even exist? And do you know what you're looking for? So when should we start shadowing? Well, that's really complex, I think. I don't have the answer to that, I really don't. What I do believe is that shadowing isn't a great technique, isn't the best technique for every learner at every stage of learning. I rather think it's a technique for the person who knows what they're looking for, who's rather advanced, and who understands certain prior technical aspects of languages. So I do think that shadowing demands prior language knowledge, technical knowledge of how languages work. That's my belief. So the ideal time to use shadowing, to me, is an open question. I really don't know. I think there is a very real risk for beginners who do shadowing to pick up mistakes that can be very hard to correct later, because in languages, once you've adopted a bad habit, it's very, very hard to correct later, because this technique of shadowing relies on less conscious reasoning and more on imitation. In my experience, correcting a bad habit in language learning is very, very hard. These bad habits have a way of cementing in the mind and crystallizing. It's very, very hard to correct someone rationally, consciously, when they've adopted a habit. Right, let's move on and talk about pronunciation now. I always thought that the correct pronunciation of a language is a bit like painting a colour. If it's too bright, it's no longer the colour, and if it's too dark, it's no longer the colour. If you're still within the colour, you're good. If people could understand you, you're good. So if your pronunciation is good enough, you will be understood. And I don't think you have to push it to extremes to try to imitate the accent from Marseille in France, or Birmingham in Britain, or New Jersey in America. And I'm saying this why? Because I think the implicit promise of shadowing is to pick up that genuine accent. Is it not? That's what I think it is. I don't think it's necessary, is what I'm saying, because sounds can be improved with an explanation and feedback from a qualified teacher or tutor, which may be a lot faster and clearer than hours of shadowing without a specific goal. So this just about concludes my take on shadowing in language learning. I'm very cautious about it. It seems to me a technique for people who know what they're looking for, specifically, and I'm talking on a technical level. You might be studying a tonal language, right? Like Mandarin and such Asian languages, and you might know that there is such a thing as a tone, a variation in tone, which influences the meaning of a word. Now this requires a technical understanding. Then the next thing is, okay, I'm going to listen to, I don't know, a discussion in Mandarin or something, and I'm going to pick up on all these tonal variations, and I'm going to rationalize afterwards how they're using them and why they're using them. This to me makes a lot more sense than just hoping that it will happen. I'm going to randomly repeat things, or I suppose there's different ways of using shadowing. But I think it still requires a certain involvement. I don't think it's for the casual learner. I really don't think so. I don't think so. I think the quicker way is always to rationalize a language, know what you're doing, why you're doing it, because it will just filter in, it will just happen subconsciously. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that. So I think that shadowing can be a useful tool, and I'll be very, very curious to know what anyone else thinks of this. If it's worked for you, if it's worked for someone you know, I'd be very, very curious to know. I think for passionate, engaged learners who already have a solid foundation in a language, such as linguists or teachers, it makes a lot of sense. It really does. Why wouldn't you do that? You almost would have to do it at one stage, the shadowing technique. But even then, I think, as I mentioned, there are many, many practical obstacles to this technique, including the question of accent, including the question of resources. And there's another thing I didn't mention yet, is that we use language according to context. So if you, for example, use an audiobook that may be read in a very, very dry tone, that's one intonation, but a journalist on television is purposely using a different intonation, which isn't very natural very often. So you have different intonations according to different situations. Native speakers use these without thinking. Just take a practical example. We're listening to an old Western with Clint Eastwood or John Wayne or something, what practically are you going to do with that film if you want to pick up an American accent? Is it a good source or not? Is a Western not a good source? What is a good source? Is the Harry Potter film a good source? Because they speak in a very, very old-fashioned way. It's not easy, is it? Because I like the idea of shadowing, but once you start to try to fit it into the real world, there's so many challenges. Anyway, my name's Chris. I teach French at OuiCommunicate. Tell me what you thought, and we'll talk about it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope it was useful. See you soon.